The moment Benjamin Thatcher rode into the dying town of Caldwell Flats, Texas, in the scorched summer of 1878, he had no idea that the worst decision of his life would turn out to be the best one he had ever made. The sun hung over the Texas panhandle like a burning coal, merciless and indifferent, baking the cracked earth into something that resembled the surface of a pottery kiln rather than land meant to sustain human life. Benjamin had been riding for 3 days straight from Abilene, carrying a saddlebag full of silver coins meant to pay off a land debt for a piece of property south of the Rio Picos that he had been saving for since he was 19 years old. He was 26 now, lean and brown from years working cattle drives and fence lines, with dark eyes that had seen enough of the world to carry a quiet kind of weight in them. His horse, a steady buckskin gelding he called Sergeant, had carried him faithfully across more miles of this unforgiving country than he could easily count. He had not planned to stop at Caldwell Flats. It was barely a town at all anymore. The railroad had gone 20 miles north of it 3 years back, and most of what had once been a modest but hopeful settlement had followed the tracks. What remained was a scattering of sun-bleached buildings, a dry goods store with half its sign missing, a watering trough that held more dust than water, and a handful of people who either could not leave or had chosen not to. Benjamin pulled Sergeant to a stop at the edge of the main road because he heard something that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. It was a child crying. Not the ordinary fretful crying of a tired or petulant child, but the hollow, exhausted kind of crying that comes from real suffering. The sound reached him before he even fully registered the source of it, and his eyes swept the roadside until he found them. A family sat in the shade of the last standing wall of what had once been a livery stable. The wall cast a narrow strip of shadow, and they were crowded into it as though that thin slice of darkness were the most precious thing in the world. A woman with tangled dark hair and sunburned skin was pressing a damp cloth against the forehead of a small boy who could not have been more than 4 years old. Beside her sat 2 older children, a girl of perhaps 8 and a boy of about 10, both of them sitting with that particular stillness that comes from having no energy left to move. A man sat apart from them slightly, his head bowed, his hands hanging empty between his knees. He had the look of a man who had been broken by something slow and grinding rather than anything sharp and sudden. Benjamin dismounted without much deliberate thought. He had grown up watching his mother do things without making much ceremony of them, and he supposed some of that had settled into his bones. He walked Sergeant over slowly, not wanting to startle the children, and crouched down a few feet away from the family. "Afternoon," he said quietly. The man looked up. His eyes were bloodshot and hollow, but there was no malice in them, only exhaustion and shame. "Afternoon," the man said back, his voice rough as gravel. "Name is Benjamin Thatcher. I am riding south." He glanced at the children. The small boy had stopped crying and was watching him with huge dark eyes. "You all look like you have been out in this sun for a while." The man swallowed. His pride was visible in the set of his jaw even through the ruins of his condition. "We have had a hard passage," he admitted. "Heading west to my sister's place near Las Cruces. Our wagon axle broke 2 days back and we had to leave it. Our water ran low." He stopped, as though cataloging their misfortunes was more than he could manage all at once. Benjamin looked at the family more carefully. The children were thin in a way that told him it was not a new thinness. The woman had the look of someone who had been quietly managing a crisis for longer than anyone should have to manage one alone. The smallest boy's lips were cracked from dehydration. Benjamin reached into his saddlebag without a word and produced his full canteen, which he had refilled that morning at a creek, and held it out toward the woman. She reached for it immediately, not with greed but with the focused efficiency of a mother whose children needed water before pride could be considered. She gave the smallest boy a few measured sips, then passed it to the older children, then drank herself, and finally looked at her husband with an expression that made Benjamin look away to give them their privacy. "We have not eaten since yesterday morning," the man said. It cost him something to say it. Benjamin could see that plainly. He went back to Sergeant's saddlebag. He had provisions for 3 days. He had dried beef, a small sack of cornmeal, dried beans, some salt pork wrapped in cloth, and a tin of hardtack biscuits. He pulled all of it out and set it down in front of the family. The older children looked at the food with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. "My name is Clarence Webb," the man said. "This is my wife Hattie and our children Thomas, Lily, and the little one is James." "How far to Las Cruces from here?" Benjamin asked, not because he did not know the answer, but because he wanted to understand what these people were facing. Clarence Webb looked at him with the careful expression of a man calculating whether to tell the truth or soften it. "Better than 140 miles, he said finally. Benjamin looked at the children. He looked at Sergeant. Sergeant was 17 hands of solid, reliable horseflesh, a horse worth more than a full season's wages for most working men. He was also Benjamin's means of reaching the land office before the deadline on his claim expired in 8 days. Without a horse, Benjamin would have to walk to the nearest town with a stage line, which was Millbrook, some 40 miles southeast across open desert country. If the stage ran on its current schedule, the earliest he could hope to be in Socorro, where the land office for his claim sat, would be 7 days from now. That was cutting it close enough to make his stomach cold. He stood for a long moment looking at the horizon. The sky was the color of hammered copper, where the sun was starting its long, slow descent. The desert stretched out in all directions with its brilliant, heartless beauty. He thought about the land. He thought about the parcel south of the Pecos, the way it sat along a curve of the river where the cottonwoods grew, the place he had been carrying in his imagination for 7 years. He had enough silver in his bag to pay the claim fee. He had the deed transfer papers. All he needed was to get there. He thought about the smallest boy's cracked lips. He untied Sergeant's reins from the post where he had loosely looped them and led the horse over to Clarence Webb. The man looked up at him with an expression that went from confusion to disbelief over the course of about 4 seconds. "You take him," Benjamin said. "He is steady and he is kind. He will carry your wife and the little ones if you spell them out. With that horse you can make Las Cruces in 4 or 5 days if you water him properly." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his second canteen, which was still a third full, and laid it with the food. "There is a settlement called Dry Fork about 30 miles west of here. They have a well. Do not miss it." Clarence Webb stood up slowly, the way a man stands when his legs are not entirely sure they want to support him. He looked at Benjamin and then at the horse and then back at Benjamin, and his face did something complicated that ended with his chin dropping to his chest for a moment before he raised it again. "I cannot take your horse, mister," he said. "I cannot do it." "You can," Benjamin said simply. "I am going the other direction. I will walk to Millbrook." He said it as though walking 40 miles across the Texas desert in summer was a mildly inconvenient errand, rather than the kind of undertaking that had killed harder men than him. Hattie Webb was looking at him now, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite pity and not quite gratitude, but something in between the two that was more powerful than either. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, and her voice was steady even though it was rough with dehydration, "the Lord is going to know what you did today." "I hope he is not keeping too close a tally," Benjamin said, which made the older boy Thomas let out a short surprised laugh that he immediately covered with his hand. He helped them load the provisions into Sergeant's saddlebags and showed Clarence the horse's particular habits. Sergeant did not like sudden movements on his left side and needed to be watered slowly after a hard ride rather than all at once. He was responsive to a light hand on the reins and would stop dead for a loud whistle, which was useful if he spooked. Clarence Webb listened to all of this with the careful attention of a man memorizing scripture. When there was nothing left to do, Benjamin shook Clarence Webb's hand, tipped his hat to Hattie, and watched the family move off toward the west with Sergeant carrying the 2 smallest children on his back, while Clarence led him by the reins and the older girl walked alongside. He watched them until they were too small to see clearly against the glare of the afternoon sun, and then he turned southeast and started walking. The first hour was not so bad. Benjamin was fit and used to physical labor, and the late afternoon heat was marginally less brutal than the midday furnace. He had kept his one remaining canteen, which held perhaps 2 cups of water, and he allowed himself small measured sips at regular intervals. He had his coat rolled and tied across his back, his hat pulled low, and his boots were good ones made to last, resoled twice already. He set a pace he thought he could sustain, and did not let himself think too hard about the miles ahead. What he thought about instead, to keep his mind off the heat and the distance, was the land office in Socorro, and the slim woman behind the counter who had helped him file his original claim papers 2 years ago. He had only met her twice, that clerk, and he could not now remember her face with any useful precision. Then he thought about his mother back in Arkansas, who had died while he was on a cattle drive to Kansas 3 years ago, and whom he had never properly mourned because there was always another job to ride to. Then he thought about the horse, which he did not regret giving away even slightly, which told him something about himself that he found mildly interesting. By the time the sun had reached the horizon and the sky had turned the extraordinary violent colors of a desert sunset, Benjamin had covered perhaps 12 miles. He estimated this by the landmarks he had noted from the saddle on his way through, a particular outcropping of red rock shaped vaguely like a seated man, which he had passed from above to his right and now had left behind him to his left. The air was cooling rapidly as the light died, which was a mercy. He kept walking. He walked through the night by the light of a half-moon that rose around 10 o'clock and cast the desert in silver and shadow. He allowed himself the last of his water just after midnight, and then he walked on with nothing. The desert at night was its own country, full of sounds that the daytime heat smothered. The stir of nocturnal creatures, the dry whisper of wind through brush, the occasional far-off cry of something wild that he could not have named even in the daylight. He had been in worse places. He kept that truth close and kept walking. Around 4 in the morning, just as the horizon to the east was beginning to show the faintest suggestion of gray, his left boot developed a loose sole that began slapping against the ground with every step, which was annoying but not fatal. He tied it as best he could with a strip of rawhide from his belt and kept going. He reached the outskirts of Millbrook at just after noon the following day. 27 hours of walking, 40 miles of desert, 1 canteen of water stretched to its absolute limit, and a boot that was more rawhide than leather by the time he arrived. He walked into the first building he came to, which was a saloon, and asked for water before anything else. The barman, a heavy man with a drooping mustache, gave him a long look and then filled a glass without asking questions, which Benjamin respected. He drank 2 full glasses of water, then asked about the stage. The next southbound stage to Socorro was in 3 days. There was nothing to be done about that. He paid for a room at the boarding house across the road, slept for 14 hours, ate an enormous breakfast the following morning, and then spent the better part of the next 2 days doing the very ordinary things that people do when they are waiting for something, and trying not to think too hard about how much depends on what comes next. It was on the afternoon of the second day, while he was sitting on the porch of the boarding house with his repaired boot on, watching the slow life of Millbrook pass by, that he first heard Rose Grayson's name. He heard it because 2 women were talking on the sidewalk nearby, and one of them said to the other, in a tone that combined admiration with a particular kind of exasperation that people reserve for someone who refuses to do the sensible thing, that Rose Grayson is going to work herself straight into the ground before she admits she needs help. Benjamin was not a nosy man by nature, but something in the cadence of the statement made him glance over. The women were both middle-aged, both carrying baskets, both speaking with the comfortable directness of people who had known each other long enough to say exactly what they meant. "Her father's debt is none of her making," the second woman said, shaking her head. Harold Grayson borrowed money from Amos Cutter and then had the poor grace to die and leave the girl to settle it. And Amos Cutter is not a patient creditor. She has the boarding house running well enough, the first woman said, but it is a boarding house in Millbrook, which is not exactly the crossroads of the known world. If she cannot meet that payment by the end of September, Cutter takes the property. The whole parcel, house and land and all. They moved on past him, their voices fading into the afternoon. Benjamin looked back at the street and thought about what he had heard with the particular compartmentalizing capacity of a man who had already made his own large sacrifice and had enough distance from it to know it had been right. He thought about it the way you think about weather, as a fact of the world that you note and file away without immediately doing anything about. He met Rose Grayson the following morning. He had gone to the dry goods store to replenish his supplies before the stage departed, and he was standing at the counter with a list he had written on a scrap of paper when the door opened behind him and the air in the store seemed to shift slightly, the way air shifts when something real enters a space. She was 23 years old, he would learn later, but she carried herself with the economy of movement of someone older, someone who had learned not to waste energy on anything that did not need doing. She was of medium height with copper-red hair that she wore pinned up firmly under a practical straw hat, and she had the kind of face that rewarded looking at it carefully. Nothing flashy or immediately arresting, but built of good clean lines that became more interesting the longer you studied them. Her eyes were green-gray, the color of sage in early light, and they moved around the store with the quick, assessing quality of someone who had learned to budget and calculate as second nature. She carried a small leather account book under one arm and a list in her other hand, and she nodded to the store owner, a Mr. Pierce, with the brisk nod of a regular customer who had neither time nor inclination for social niceties that served no practical purpose. Benjamin moved slightly to give her room at the counter, and she glanced at him with the automatic acknowledgement that anyone in the West extended to a stranger, an assessment that took perhaps 2 seconds, and concluded that he was neither a threat nor anyone she knew, and then she returned her attention to Mr. Pierce. "The flour I ordered last week, Mr. Pierce," she said. "I need to know whether it arrived on yesterday's wagon." "It did, Miss Grayson. 20 pounds as ordered. Shall I add it to your account?" "No," she said, with a firmness that told Benjamin everything about the state of that account. "I will pay for it today." She opened her small account book and counted out coins with careful precision. He noticed her hands. They were not the hands of a woman who had lived easily. There was a small burn scar on the back of the right one, and her knuckles were reddened from work, but her fingers were long and the movements were deft and certain. He got his own supplies together and paid, and he was outside by the time she emerged from the store. The morning sun hit the copper of her hair and made it briefly extraordinary. She was not paying attention to him at all. She was looking at her account book with a small vertical line between her brows that he recognized as the expression of someone adding numbers and not arriving at a satisfying sum. "Excuse me," he said, and immediately felt somewhat foolish for saying it since he had nothing particular to follow it with. She looked up. The green-gray eyes were direct and not unkind, but also not inclined toward unnecessary patience. "Yes, I am staying at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house," he said. "I believe you may be the proprietor. I wanted to tell you that the breakfast this morning was the best meal I have eaten in a very long time, and I have been riding and working through 5 states, so that is not a small thing to say." Something shifted in her expression, not much but enough. The line between her brows eased slightly, and the set of her mouth, which had been efficient and contained, found a small involuntary curve. "That is kind of you to say, Mr. Thatcher. Benjamin Thatcher. Mr. Thatcher." She looked at him for a second more with that quick assessing quality. "Where are you headed?" "Socorro. I have business at the land office there. The stage leaves tomorrow morning at 6. "I know it." "I will be on it." She nodded and would have moved on, but something made him say, because the information was sitting in him from the conversation he had overheard, and he had never been very good at ignoring things that troubled him. "I hope whatever difficulties you are managing here ease up soon. This town is lucky to have someone keeping a decent table." She stopped. The look she gave him then was different from the previous ones, more searching, less automatic. She was trying to determine whether he knew something, and how much, and whether she should be concerned about it. He held her gaze steadily and with no particular agenda, and after a moment she seemed to conclude that he was simply being genuine. "Thank you," she said, and this time she meant it. "Safe travels, Mr. Thatcher." He watched her walk down the street with her flower and her account book and her copper hair disappearing under the straw hat's brim, and he thought, well. He did not elaborate on the thought. He simply picked up his saddlebags and walked back to the boarding house. That evening, he ate supper at the long table in the boarding house dining room along with 4 other travelers and 2 permanent residents of Millbrook who had taken rooms for the month. Rose Grayson served the meal herself, with the help of a young Mexican girl named Pillar who moved around the table quickly and quietly. The meal was beef stew with dumplings, fresh cornbread, and a dried peach pie that made the permanent resident to Benjamin's left, an old man named Dodd, close his eyes with an expression of uncomplicated pleasure. Benjamin watched Rose the way you watch something you are trying to understand. She moved through the room with complete competence and no waste of motion, filling glasses and managing the pace of the meal, answering questions from the travelers about roads and distances with information so accurate and current that one of the men actually wrote down what she told him. But underneath, the efficient surface of her there was something that Benjamin, who had spent years reading the moods of men and landscapes, could identify as a kind of sustained, controlled tension. Like a rope carrying more weight than it was designed for, each fiber taut and holding. After the other diners had drifted away from the table, Benjamin lingered over his coffee and offered to carry the heavy pot of remaining stew back to the kitchen because it was sitting near him, and it was the obvious practical thing to do. Rose glanced at him when he stood with it, and for a moment he thought she might refuse on principle, but she simply said, "Kitchen is through that door," and let him carry it. The kitchen was warm and organized with the particular precision of someone who had to be efficient, because they could not afford to be anything else. Pillar was washing dishes at the pump sink. Rose came in behind Benjamin, and without ceremony they fell into the natural rhythm of clearing the kitchen together. He carried the heavy things. She directed, stacked, and stored with the ease of long practice. They did not say much for the first several minutes, and what they said was practical. "Where does this go? Is this for tomorrow? Shall I put these here?" Then she said, while wiping down the long wooden work table with a cloth, "You are not from Texas." "Arkansas," he said, "originally. I have been moving around since I was about 18. What moves a man that much?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I suppose I was always looking for land that felt like it was mine, the kind of place where you stop and know you are done moving." She was quiet for a moment, running the cloth in even strokes along the table's grain. "And have you found it?" "I think so. I believe I have." He leaned against the doorframe. "South of the Pecos there is a stretch of bottomland along a river bend, cottonwoods and good grass and enough water that the summers would not kill the cattle. I have the money to pay the claim fee. I just need to get to the office before the deadline." She looked up from the table. "What happens if you miss it? Someone else gets the land. How close is it?" He gave a small, honest smile. "Closer than I would like." She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the peculiar sensation of being read very accurately by someone who had no reason to care about his particular situation, and yet who found it somehow relevant. "What made you late?" she asked. He told her. Not with drama or with any expectation of credit, but simply as a fact of what had happened. The family in the shade of the broken livery wall, the children with their sunburned faces, the smallest boy's cracked lips, the horse. He told it the way he would have told anyone, straightforwardly. He watched her face as he spoke and saw something move through it that went deeper than the surface efficiency. her hand stilled on the cloth. "You walked 40 miles," she said when he finished. "Through the night mostly it was cooler. And you do not regret it?" "No." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the table and resumed her wiping, but the quality of the silence between them had changed. It was a warmer silence, a more considered one. "My father was a man who made sacrifices," she said, half to herself, half to the table. "Larger ones than he should have, for people who were not always worth it. He nearly bankrupted us twice, helping neighbors who did not help him back." She paused. "I used to be angry at him for it. I am less angry now." "What changed?" She folded the cloth neatly and laid it over the edge of the wash basin. "He died," she said simply, with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who has had time to arrive at acceptance even when they would have preferred not to need it. "And I understood better after. He did not offer condolences. She did not seem to want them. She had already incorporated her grief into the structure of herself, the way a river incorporates a new stone, flowing around it and past it and becoming itself again. He respected that. "I heard," he said, and he chose his words carefully because he did not want to intrude where he was not invited, "that there is a debt situation. You do not have to tell me anything about it. But if there is something I can do before I leave tomorrow morning, I am a fair hand with repairs and I have some small experience with legal paperwork, and neither of those things costs you anything." She looked at him again with that searching quality, that attempt to locate the angle, the hidden motive, the thing a person usually wanted when they offered something. She seemed to find nothing she recognized as a threat, and this appeared to unsettle her slightly more than if she had found something, because people offering things for nothing was rarer than people offering things for something. "Why?" she asked directly. "Because you are running a clean, honest operation in a hard situation and someone should say so," he said. "And because tomorrow I will be on that stage and I will not be back this direction for a while. And it seems like a poor use of an evening to sit on a porch doing nothing when there is something useful to be done." Pillar at the sink had gone very quiet and studiously focused on her dishes, but Benjamin noticed the small smile she directed at the basin. Rose said, "The back porch has a loose railing that I have been meaning to fix for 3 weeks, and the kitchen stove has a flue joint that is letting in cold air, and it is going to be a problem when winter comes. I can look at both tonight if you have tools," he said. She had tools. Her father's tools, organized in a wooden box under the kitchen work table, with the same care that everything in this kitchen was organized. Benjamin took the box and the lamp she lit for him and went to work, and Rose sat at the kitchen table with her account book, and the particular focused silence of someone doing arithmetic by lamplight with a great deal riding on the answer. He worked for 2 hours. The railing required new support posts and some new cut boards, which he fashioned from a short piece of lumber in the small outbuilding off the kitchen. The flue joint needed new clay packing, which she had in a tin on the shelf. He worked steadily and without fuss, the way a man works when the work itself is satisfying and the company, even silent, is good. When he came back inside to wash the clay and sawdust from his hands, she was still at the table with the account book, but she was not writing. She was looking at nothing in particular with an expression that was tired in a very specific way, the tiredness of someone who has run the numbers again and arrived at the same discouraging answer. He dried his hands and sat down at the table across from her without asking, because it was his last evening here and he had run out of reasons to be careful about things that did not call for caution. "How much?" he asked. She looked at him sharply. "The debt," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I did not hear the conversation on the street yesterday afternoon. I have good ears and no control over what other people say at full volume. How much is owed to this Cutter person?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, with the careful dignity of someone who had not spoken the number to anyone because saying it out loud made it more real, she said, $240, by the 30th of September. Benjamin nodded slowly. It was a significant sum. Not impossible, but very far from easy, especially for a boarding house in a town that was slowly emptying out. He thought about his own $200 in silver coins, now somewhat depleted by the stage fare and his supplies. He had enough for the claim fee with a small margin, not enough for both. "The boarding house," he said. "How many rooms?" "6, 4 of them let regularly, 2 empty." She paused. "In the good years when the cattle drives were coming through more, I had all 6 full and a waiting list. This year the main drive routes shifted north." She looked down at the account book. "I will make the payment," she said, and there was iron in it. "I just need a little more time or a good month or both." "Have you spoken to Cutter directly?" Amos Cutter is not a man who responds well to direct conversation from a woman. He prefers to deal through my neighbor, Mr. Hardcastle, whom I am to understand is in his employ. She said this with a dry precision that contained a great deal of carefully managed anger. "That seems like a situation worth examining more closely," Benjamin said. "I have examined it quite closely," she said, and the dryness in her voice had an edge now. "Amos Cutter is the most powerful man in the county. He owns the feed mill, the north pasture land, and approximately half the goodwill of every official who matters within 50 miles. My father borrowed from him in good faith at a rate that seemed reasonable and turned out not to be, and Cutter has been managing the interest on that debt in ways that ensure it never quite gets smaller." She closed the account book. "I know exactly what I am dealing with. I simply have limited options for dealing with it." "Write it down," Benjamin said. "Everything. The original debt amount, every payment made, every interest charge, the dates and the witnesses, if any. The exact language of whatever paper your father signed." She looked at him. "If Cutter is managing the interest dishonestly," Benjamin said, "there is a legal argument to be made. I have seen it done. I am not a lawyer, but I have watched enough land disputes and debt cases to know that the right letter to the right person, with the right documentation, can change the entire picture." He paused. "The land office in Socorro has a clerk named Watts who handles property disputes. He is an honest man. I know him slightly. I could take a letter from you and put it directly in his hands." The silence stretched long enough that he heard the night insects outside, the creak of the house settling in the cooling air, the far-off sound of someone's dog barking 3 streets over. "You would do that," she said. Not a question. She was looking at him with that careful, searching quality, and this time what she found seemed to be not a threat or an angle but something she did not quite have a word for and therefore looked at more carefully than usual. "I would do it on the way south," he said. "It is not out of my way, and as I said, I have nothing more useful to do with my time between here and there than carry a letter." She was quiet for another moment, and then she did something he had not yet seen her do. She smiled. Not the small, involuntary curve from the morning, but a real smile, one that reached the green-gray eyes and changed the whole quality of her face, lit it from somewhere within. It was the smile of someone who had been managing alone for so long that a genuine offer of uncomplicated help had become a surprising thing. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "you are a peculiar man." "I have been told that," he said. They sat at the table in the warm kitchen for another hour, and she brought out the paper her father had signed with Amos Cutter, and a small journal in which she had recorded every payment and transaction in her careful, neat handwriting, and together they went through it line by line. What emerged from this process was something that made Benjamin's jaw tighten with a very focused anger. Cutter had been adding compounding interest charges retroactively, in apparent violation of the original terms. The debt as her father had understood it was one thing. The debt as Cutter was currently calculating it was another thing entirely, and the difference between the two was not small. "This is fraud," Benjamin said quietly, looking at the numbers. "I know it," Rose said. She had known it for a long time. He could see that in her face. Knowing it and proving it to someone with the authority to act on it are 3 different problems. "I know someone who handles exactly this kind of problem," he said, thinking again of Watts in Socorro, and also of a traveling circuit judge named Fairweather who had a reputation for honesty and a deep personal distaste for predatory lending. "Write the letter. I will carry it, and I will make sure it gets to someone who can do something with it." She wrote the letter that night. It was very good. She wrote with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about every word she committed to paper, and the letter laid out the chronology of the debt, the original terms, the payments made, and the discrepancies in Cutter's accounting with a clarity and directness that Benjamin thought was more persuasive than most legal briefs he had encountered. She copied it twice, keeping one copy herself. When she folded the letter and sealed it and held it out to him, she held it for just a moment before releasing it, as though weighing whether to trust this stranger with the most important document she possessed. Then she let it go. "I will see it done," he said. "I believe you," she said. And she meant it. He could see that she meant it, and the fact that this clear-eyed, practical, self-reliant woman meant it landed in his chest with a weight and a warmth that he was not entirely prepared for. He left on the stage the following morning at 6, as planned. Rose Grayson was not at the stage stop to see him off. He had not expected her to be. But when he climbed into the coach, Pillar appeared out of nowhere and pressed a cloth-wrapped package into his hands, 2 cornbread biscuits and a piece of dried peach pie. He ate them on the road south and thought about the hands that had made them, and the green-gray eyes, and the way she had smiled in the lamplight at the kitchen table. The stage to Socorro took 2 days with an overnight stop at a relay station. Benjamin spent the journey west of Discomfort in a crowded coach, alternating between looking out the window at the country moving past and looking inward at a question that had set itself up in his mind without invitation. What was he going to do about Rose Grayson? This was not precisely the question he had expected to be asking himself before the deadline on his land claim. But the mind does not always cooperate with practical scheduling, and whatever it was that had happened in that kitchen, in that lamplight, over those numbers and that letter, had done something to the interior of him that he was honest enough to acknowledge even if he had not yet decided what to do about it. He arrived in Socorro on the morning of the 6th day since leaving Millbrook. He went to the land office first, because that was the practical priority, and he was a practical man. The clerk at the office was not Watts, but a young man named Aldridge who confirmed that Benjamin's claim was still valid and processed his payment with brisk efficiency. The land was his. The parcel south of the Pecos with the cottonwood bend and the good grass and the river water was his. He stood outside the land office in the Socorro sunlight with the deed in his hand, and felt the thing he had expected to feel, the deep bedrock satisfaction of a dream completed. But it was quieter than he had imagined it would be, as though part of the emotional space he had been saving for this moment had already been occupied by something else. He found Watts that afternoon. The clerk was a small, wiry man of about 50 with reading spectacles, and the manner of someone who had dealt with human dishonesty for so long that it no longer surprised him but still offended him. He read Rose's letter with complete attention, his face giving nothing away, and then he read it again. "These discrepancies are not subtle," Watts said, setting the letter down on his desk. "No," Benjamin agreed. "The woman who wrote this, she has the original paperwork. She has copies. The originals are in her keeping." Watts picked up the letter again and looked at it. "Amos Cutter," he said, as though the name were a weather condition he had encountered before and expected to encounter again. "I am aware of Mr. Cutter's methods." He folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. "I know a man at the Federal Land Authority who has been looking for a documented case of this specific practice in this specific county for 2 years. He looked at Benjamin over his spectacles. "Tell the woman to hold the original documents safely and to write directly to this address." He wrote a name and address on a slip of paper and handed it across. "Tell her to do it soon." Benjamin took the paper. "How long will it take?" "If the documentation is what this letter says it is." Watts considered. 3 months, possibly less. Federal Land Authority moves faster when the documentation is clear. He paused. "And tell her not to make any more payments to Cutter until she hears back. Any payment she makes under the fraudulent accounting could be construed as acceptance of those terms." Benjamin sat with this information for a moment and then said, "You are certain of that?" "I am certain enough," Watts said. "I have seen it work before, and I have seen Amos Cutter lose before when someone had the patience and the documentation to stand the ground." Benjamin rode south the next morning to see his land. He was not supposed to feel this much. That was what he thought as he stood on the bank of the Pecos at the Cottonwood Bend in the late afternoon of the following day, the grass going gold around him, the river running clear and cool over the stones. He had waited years for this moment, and it was everything he had hoped it would be: the perfect curve of the river, the shade of the cottonwoods, the sense of a place that wanted to be lived in. He held the deed in his hands and looked at it all and thought, but she should see this. He was back in Millbrook 11 days after he had left on the stage. He came back on horseback, having bought a new horse in Socorro, a solid bay mare that he named May, not as impressive as Sargent had been but willing and strong. He rode into Millbrook on a Thursday afternoon and went directly to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house without stopping to examine whether this was a measured or wise decision, because he had spent 11 days examining it, and had arrived at the conclusion that wisdom was not always the most relevant criterion. Rose Grayson opened the front door of the boarding house when he knocked, and the look that crossed her face when she saw him standing on her porch was the most honest thing he had seen in a long time. It lasted less than a second, a flash of something startled and bright and deeply unguarded, before her expression settled back into its composed and practical usual arrangement. But he had seen it. "Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Miss Grayson." He took off his hat. "I have news. May I come in?" She stepped back to let him in, and they sat in the small parlor off the entryway where she met with guests, a tidy room with 2 chairs and a table and a window that looked onto the street. He told her everything: Watts, the Federal Land Authority, the address she needed to write to, the instruction not to make any further payments. He gave her the slip of paper with the name and address written on it and watched her read it. "Watts said 3 months," he said. "Possibly less." She held the paper in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were very bright, and he understood that she was not a woman who wept easily, which meant the brightness was something she was actively managing, which told him more about how much this meant than any other expression could have. "Thank you," she said. The simplicity of it was the measure of how much was behind it. He said, "Hold all your original documentation safely," Benjamin said, "and write soon." "I will write tonight." She set the paper down on the table with a careful precision, as though it were something that might break if handled carelessly. Then she looked at him with the direct assessing quality that he had come to identify as her default, her natural way of engaging with the world. "You came back," she said. "You did not have to come back in person. You could have posted a letter." "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a moment without speaking, because the answer was one that had several layers and he wanted to give her the honest one. "Because I wanted to see your face when you read that paper," he said. "And because I want to tell you about the land, if you will listen. And because I have not been able to stop thinking about a conversation we had in this kitchen 11 days ago, and a woman who runs a clean, honest operation against considerable odds, and I would like to know if there is any chance she has thought about me at all in that time." The silence that followed this was of a very particular quality. Rose Grayson sat very still for a moment, her hands in her lap, her green-gray eyes on his face, reading him with that complete focused attention. She turned on things she wanted to understand fully. He held still under it without defense. "I have thought about you," she said at last, with a directness that he found extraordinarily attractive. More than was strictly practical. "Well then," he said, and felt something in his chest ease open like a door in spring. She made tea. This was how she dealt with significant emotional moments. He would learn, by doing something useful with her hands while her mind caught up with her heart. He sat in the kitchen and watched her move around it and told her about the land, about the Cottonwood Bend and the river and the way the grass went gold in the late afternoon. He told it the way you tell something to someone you want to be able to see it, and she listened with the full quality of attention that she brought to everything, leaning slightly forward over her tea. "It sounds beautiful," she said. "It is," he said. "It is the kind of place that needs to be lived in. A cabin, eventually a proper house, some cattle, a garden if there is someone with the inclination." He paused. "I have been thinking that I would need to come back to Millbrook before I start building, because there are things here that seem worth staying near." She looked at him with that brightness in her eyes again, and the small smile that he was increasingly convinced was one of the most remarkable things he had ever seen. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "are you telling me you came back to Millbrook for me?" "I am telling you," he said carefully, "that I came back to deliver a message in person that I could have sent by post, and that the reason I chose the longer route is sitting across this table from me." She was quiet again. "Then, the boarding house is still my responsibility, for at least several months until the Cutter business is resolved. I know it. I am not the kind of woman who leaves a thing unfinished. I know that too. It is one of the things I find most compelling about you." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Stay. At least for a while, take a room. It would be good to have someone here who is not afraid of Amos Cutter, and the back porch still needs a proper balustrade." The corner of her mouth moved. "And I find that I cook better when there is someone worth cooking for." He stayed. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Benjamin Thatcher's life to that point, and he recognized them as such while they were happening, which is a rarer thing than most people realize. He took the corner room on the second floor that caught the morning light, and he worked around the boarding house with the focused energy of a man who has found a place he wants to be. He rebuilt the back porch balustrade properly. He repaired the kitchen stove flue joint in a more permanent way. He replastered the front parlor wall where the mud plaster had crumbled away from the window frame. He spoke to the local suppliers Rose dealt with and renegotiated 2 of her flour and salt pork contracts to better terms, because he had a trader's instinct and a directness with prices that she found both useful and entertaining. Rose wrote her letter to the Federal Land Authority the night Benjamin returned, and sent it the following morning. She sent it with the same focused precision she brought to everything, along with a carefully organized packet of documentation. The original debt paper with its terms, her father's record book of payments, and a 4-page summary of the discrepancies between the agreed-upon interest rate and the rate Cutter had actually charged. It was a thorough and damning document, and once she had sent it, she held the Cutter problem at an arm's length in her mind, not dismissing it but no longer letting it consume the interior space of her days. The interior space of her days was increasingly occupied by Benjamin Thatcher. She had not expected to feel this way about a stranger who had ridden into town on the stage and fixed her back porch and carried her letter to Socorro. She had not had much room in the last 3 years for feelings that did not serve an immediate practical purpose. Since her father's death, she had been running the boarding house, managing the debt, managing the staff, managing the slow attrition of a town losing its reason for existing, and she had done all of it with the controlled competence that was her chief strength, and had not spent much time asking herself what she wanted rather than what needed doing. What she was discovering, with a somewhat alarming velocity, was that she wanted to talk to Benjamin Thatcher. She wanted to hear what he thought about things. He was not a man of excessive words, which she appreciated, but when he spoke he said things that were worth hearing. Honest observations, clean logical connections, the occasional dry humor that arrived without warning and made her laugh before she had time to decide whether to. She wanted to watch him work, because there was something very satisfying about the way he worked, focused and unhurried and good at it. She wanted to sit in the kitchen after the evening meal and talk with him over coffee in the way they had fallen into the habit of doing, the lamp burning low, the house settling around them. She had not wanted any particular person in a very long time. The specific wanting of a specific person was something new, and it was both more uncomfortable and more interesting than she had expected. He was not pushing her toward anything. That was important to her. He was simply there, reliable and present and undemanding, occupying his corner of the boarding house as though he had always been part of the place. He helped without being asked, and without making it a transaction. He treated Pillar with the same matter-of-fact respect he showed everyone, which she noticed and approved of. He talked to old Dodd in the evenings about cattle and old range routes with a patience and interest that made the old man's face light up in a way it had not in months. She thought one evening while she was writing up the week's accounts, and he was sitting across the table reading a surveying manual by lamplight, a very good man. Not in the performing, demonstrating way that some men used goodness as a credential. In the quiet structural way, where it was simply built into how he moved through the world. She looked up from her accounts and said, without planning to, "Tell me something about your family." He looked up from the manual. "My father died when I was 11, fever. My mother raised me and my 2 sisters on a hardscrabble farm in Arkansas until I was old enough to work for wages. My mother died 3 years ago. My sisters are both married and settled, one in Missouri and one in Kansas City. I see them when I can." He paused. "I never had the right kind of roots before to make a family feel like it could hold. I was always moving." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her steadily across the table. "And now I have land that I own outright south of the Pecos. And I have found that moving has lost most of its appeal." She held his gaze for a moment. This man, who had given his horse to a starving family and walked 40 miles through the desert, and come back to Millbrook, not because he had any remaining business here, but because of her. She held the weight of that in her chest for a moment, and felt it settle there with a solidity that was unlike anything she had felt in a very long time. "Benjamin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and both of them noticed it. "Rose," he said, with a quietness that was its own kind of declaration. The first time he kissed her was 3 weeks after his return, on the back porch in the early evening, when the western sky was doing something spectacular with reds and golds, and the temperature had dropped enough that the air finally felt like something other than punishment. They had been standing at the newly repaired railing looking at the sunset with their coffee cups in hand, and she had said something about how the desert did its best work at the very end of the day, when it thought no one was grading it, and he had turned to look at her profile against that riotous sky, and had simply gone with the uncomplicated honesty of what he wanted. He set down his coffee cup. He turned to face her fully. He said her name again, and she turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his face in that moment resolved something in her own expression into something very still and open, and he kissed her gently, and with all the care of a man who understood that the best things are worth being careful with. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything. No hesitation once she had decided, no holding back of the things she actually felt. When they separated, she was looking at him with eyes that were very bright, and with an expression that was entirely Rose Grayson and entirely new at the same time. This woman who had been containing so much for so long, letting something open at last. "Well," she said, in an echo of what he had said in this same kitchen weeks ago, and he laughed, a real full laugh, and she joined him, and it was one of those moments that writes itself permanently into the architecture of a person's interior life. The response from the Federal Land Authority came 5 weeks later, faster than Watts had predicted. It came in the form of a letter that Rose opened at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, while Benjamin was outside mending the gate on the property's south fence, a letter written in the formal measured language of official correspondence, but containing, between the official lines, very good news indeed. The Land Authority investigator had reviewed the documentation and found substantial evidence of usurious practice in violation of the original debt terms. Amos Cutter had been formally notified of the investigation. Pending the completion of the investigation, all debt service was suspended. The letter also noted, in the careful language of such correspondence, that the preliminary findings suggested Rose Grayson had overpaid the original debt principal by some $90 under a proper accounting of the interest, which meant Cutter potentially owed her money rather than the reverse. She sat with the letter for a full minute before she could trust herself to stand up and walk to the door. Then she went to the door and called Benjamin's name. He looked up from the gate with a question in his face, and she held up the letter, and he crossed the yard in about 8 strides and took it from her and read it standing there in the morning sun with the dust of the yard on his boots and his hat pushed back on his head. When he finished reading, he looked up at her with a grin that she had not yet seen at full brightness, and it was considerable. $90, he said. That he owes me, she confirmed, and her voice was steady but her hands were shaking slightly, and he took her hands in his, letter and all, and held them until they steadied. It is not over yet, she said, the practical part of her keeping its footing. The investigation has to complete. It will complete, he said. You have the documentation, you have the honest accounting, you have what's behind it. He looked at her hands in his. You are going to keep this boarding house, Rose. She looked at him with the boarding house and the debt and the 3 years of managed crisis all in her eyes at once. I know, she said, and for the first time in 3 years she believed it all the way down. Amos Cutter came to see her himself on the following Saturday. This was not something she had expected. Cutter was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s, with the groomed, careful appearance of someone who spent money on their surface presentation as a form of social argument. He arrived in a buggy with his man Hardcastle and knocked on the front door of the boarding house with the slightly too deliberate confidence of a man who has recently received unwelcome information and is recalibrating his position. Benjamin was in the parlor when Rose answered the door, not by design but because he had been replacing the parlor's east window latch which had been sticking. He was still there, quiet, when Rose brought Cutter into the parlor to speak. Cutter's eyes moved to Benjamin with a calculation that Benjamin met with the steady, completely unintimidated look of a man who owned land outright and had nothing Cutter could threaten. Cutter made his offer to Rose. He would accept the original principal balance as full settlement of the debt, no further claims, a clean closure. He framed this as generosity. Rose, with a precise and thorough command of the facts that made Cutter's composure develop a small but visible crack, declined. She told him instead what the land authority's preliminary findings suggested about the overpayment, and she told him that she had every confidence in the investigation's process and that she looked forward to its conclusion. She said all of this in the same direct, measured voice she used for everything. Cutter left without the outcome he had come for, and the look he gave Benjamin on the way out was the look of a man filing something under future consideration, which Benjamin noted and also filed. You were magnificent, Benjamin told her once the buggy had rolled away down the street. I was accurate, she corrected him, but she was smiling. Same thing with you. Hardcastle came back the following week without Cutter, and he came in the evening when the boarding house was quiet, which was a different kind of visit, the kind meant to apply a different kind of pressure. Benjamin happened to be on the front porch. Hardcastle was a lean, weathered man who worked for Cutter in the particular capacity that powerful men in this era employed certain hard-faced men, to make their persuasion feel physical without actually becoming physical. He stopped when he saw Benjamin. Benjamin stood up from the porch chair and said, without particular heat, I do not believe Miss Grayson is receiving visitors this evening. Hardcastle looked at him for a long moment, reading the same stillness that Benjamin had learned very young from the cattle drives, where the ability to stand absolutely calm in the face of something that wanted to be a confrontation was often the thing that determined whether it became one. Cutter is not done with this property, Hardcastle said. Cutter's time with this property is a matter for the Federal Land Authority now, Benjamin said, which means Cutter and you have no further business here. You are welcome to come back with a legal document. Anything else you are trespassing. Hardcastle left. He did not come back. The investigation concluded 11 weeks after the initial letter. The Federal Land Authority found in Rose's favor on every material count. Amos Cutter was required to issue a formal deed of satisfaction on the original debt and to return $92 to Rose Grayson, representing the overpayment under a proper accounting. He lost two other properties in adjacent counties under related proceedings that the investigation had opened up, which occupied enough of his attention and legal resources that he subsequently left Millbrook's affairs largely alone. The day the final letter arrived, Rose sat at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. Benjamin sat across from her and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The debt that had been her father's, the debt that had been haunting the edges of everything she had built for 3 years, was gone. The boarding house was hers, clean and entirely hers, debt-free and in good repair, with 6 rooms and a kitchen that worked properly and a back porch with a balustrade that would last 20 years. She looked up from the letter and found him watching her with the particular quality of attention he gave her. That focused, warm, undemanding regard that she had come to understand was not simply courtesy but something deeper, something that saw her fully and was glad of what it saw. "What do you want?" she asked him, and what she meant was, "What do you want from your life now? What does the land south of the Pecos look like in your plans? And what, if anything, do those plans include me as?" He understood what she was asking. He had been waiting for her to ask it, or something like it, because he did not want to press her toward anything that she had not decided she wanted first. "I want to build on the Pecos land," he said, "a real house, the kind that is meant to stay. I want cattle and I want to learn where the water is in the dry years. I want the cottonwoods in the mornings." He paused. "And I want you there with me, if that is something you could want. If leaving here is something you could do." He looked at her steadily. "I am not asking you to leave something behind. I am asking if there is something ahead that you might want to go toward." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him, and he thought of the first time he had seen her in the dry goods store, the copper-haired woman with the account book and the careful hands and the green-gray eyes that moved over everything with that frank assessing quality. He thought of the kitchen in the lamplight, the numbers and the letter, and the way she had looked when she first smiled. He thought of the 40 miles of desert he had walked and the horse he had given away and the claim fee and the stage and all the miles in between. And he thought that all of it had been moving towards something that he could not have named when he started, but that was sitting across this kitchen table from him right now with her hands folded over an official letter and a question in her eyes. "I have run this boarding house for 3 years," she said. "I know I can run it. I know I am capable of it. And I know," she added, with the particular honest self-knowledge that was one of her chief qualities, "that I have been running it not only because it needed running but because I was not ready to look at what I might want when the crisis was resolved." "And now," he said, "and now the crisis is resolved," she said, "and I am looking." The green-gray eyes settled on his face with a fullness and a certainty that made something in his chest sing. "I would like to see the cottonwoods," she said, "and the river at the bend. And I would like to find out whether I have an inclination for a garden, because no one has ever given me the space to find out." He smiled at her, the full bright smile that she had first seen on the morning of the good news from the land authority, the one that was considerable and warm and entirely him. "Then come with me," he said. "Come with me, and let us find out together what we are capable of building." They were married in Millbrook on the first Saturday of December, 1878, in the small white church on the north end of town that had been holding services since the town's founding, and that smelled of pine resin and candle wax and old wool coats. The minister was a round-faced man named Reverend Alcott, who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and only a small amount of official ceremony, because neither Benjamin nor Rose was inclined toward ceremony for its own sake. Pillar cried quietly and continuously throughout the service, and smiled enormously the entire time she was doing it. Old Dodd sat in the front pew with his hat in his lap, and watched with the expression of a man witnessing something he had correctly predicted and felt entitled to take quiet credit for. Rose wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself in the 3 weeks preceding the wedding, and she wore her copper hair down rather than pinned up for the first time he had seen it, and it fell past her shoulders in a way that made him stand very still for a moment when he saw her coming through the church's side door. She looked at him with those clear sage-colored eyes and smiled the full smile, the one that lit her from inside, and he took her hand when she reached him and held it with the certainty of something that has found its right place. They said the words simply and meant them completely. They sold the boarding house the following spring to a family named Whitfield, who had come west from Tennessee with the specific ambition of running just such a business, and who had a daughter old enough to help in the kitchen, and a father who could fix things, and a mother who was a very good cook. Rose spent 3 days showing Mrs. Whitfield the kitchen systems and suppliers, and the particular requirements of the stove flue, and when she was done, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room that had been the center of her world for 3 years with the clear, honest eyes of someone who was grateful for what a place had given her, and was also fully ready to go. Benjamin was waiting in the yard with May and a new wagon they had bought second-hand from the livery in Millbrook, loaded with the things that would build a new life south of the Pecos: tools, seed, bedding, cooking implements, Rose's good cast iron pots, the box of her father's tools that she had kept, and a new rifle in the wagon box because the country they were headed into was beautiful and wild, and required respect in practical as well as philosophical terms. Pillar, who was 17 and had been quietly developing both culinary skills and opinions over the 3 years she had worked for Rose, had decided she wanted to come with them, or at least to come as far as Las Cruces, where she had family. They took her as far as Las Cruces, where her aunt ran a small restaurant, and said goodbye in that particular practical way of people who do not want to be sentimental, but feel it deeply regardless. Rose pressed 3 months of back wages into Pillar's hands, and Pillar held on to Rose for a long moment, and then stepped back and looked at both of them with the calm, approving expression of someone who has watched something good come together from the beginning. The road south to the Pecos land was 4 days with the wagon, through country that was simultaneously harsh and heartbreaking in its beauty. The desert in early spring had the particular quality of a place that knows exactly how hard it has been, and is now, cautiously, allowing itself to be something lovely. The sage was silvery and fragrant after the rains. The sky was that specific blue that only exists over open country, too large and too clear for anything but complete honesty. They talked on the road the way two people talk when they are building the shared language of a life, learning the particular inflections of each other's thoughts, the habits of mind, and feeling that you only discover in the sustained proximity of travel. He learned that she woke up fully awake with no transition period, which he found impressive. She learned that he was completely useless as a companion in the first half hour after waking until he had coffee, which she found both charming and logistically important to know. He told her about the cattle drives in more detail, the enormous Kansas skies, and the way the longhorns moved across the plains. She told him about her father with more depth than she had before, about his generous, impractical heart and his laughter, and the way he had read to her from whatever books he could find until she fell asleep. And her voice when she talked about him was fond and clear rather than weighted with unprocessed grief. They arrived at the Pecos land on the 4th afternoon, in exactly the late light that Benjamin had described to her in the kitchen in Millbrook. The cottonwoods were green and swaying in a river wind, and the water in the bend was clear over smooth stones, and the grass on the bottomland was deep and good, and the light was coming through the cottonwood leaves in a way that turned everything to something between gold and green. Rose stood at the edge of the river and looked at it all and said nothing for a full minute, which was how he knew she truly loved it. She turned to look at him standing beside her with the last of the afternoon light on his face and the deep settled satisfaction of a man who has arrived at the place he has been moving toward for 7 years. "It is exactly how you described it," she said. "I know," he said. "I told you the truth." "You always do," she said. They set up a canvas shelter that first night and cooked over a fire at the river's edge and listened to the water and the cottonwoods and the vast quiet of the country around them. She leaned into his side after supper, and he put his arm around her and they looked at the fire. And it was one of those silences that does not need filling, the kind that is itself a form of deep contentment. They built the house together through that spring and into the summer. Benjamin did the heavy framing and the roofing, and Rose worked alongside him on the things that required two pairs of hands, and they hired a Mexican carpenter named Santos from the nearest settlement 12 miles east for 2 weeks to help with the interior work. The house went up steadily and right, a solid 2-room structure to begin with a large stone fireplace and a kitchen corner with a proper stove that Benjamin sourced from a trading post 40 miles north. He put in a window in the kitchen that faced east so the morning light would come in while she cooked, because he had noticed how she worked best in good light. She planted her garden in May. It turned out she did have an inclination for a garden, a strong one, and she pursued it with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything, reading everything she could find about what grew in river bottomland desert and consulting the Mexican families in the nearby settlement, who knew the land intimately and who shared their knowledge with a generosity that she received with equal generosity, feeding them well when they came to help and treating them with the respect that was unfortunately not universal among Anglo settlers in the territory, something she was clear-eyed about and in deliberate opposition to. By the end of that first summer, the house was solid and the garden was producing tomatoes, squash, beans, chili peppers, and a modest but successful corn crop that she harvested with a satisfaction that was almost fierce in its quality. Benjamin had bought 12 cattle and 2 horses from a rancher to the north, and the bottomland grass was supporting them well. He fenced the river bank with the particular care of a man who knows that water is the foundation of everything in this country, and he rode the perimeter of the property with a regular attention that was not paranoia but practical stewardship. He wrote to his sister in Kansas City and described the land and the house, and the woman he had married with the slightly awkward earnestness of a man who is not given to letters, but who has so much that is good that he cannot help himself. His sister Mary wrote back an enthusiastic response full of questions and an open invitation to visit, and Rose read the letter with a warm interest in these people who were now her family by extension. She wrote back herself, a long, detailed, vivid letter that described the Cottonwood Bend and the garden and the particular quality of the desert light that made his sister write back 3 weeks later saying she had read the letter twice and planned to come visit in the spring. News came from Millbrook in October of that year through old Dodd, who had written to Benjamin in the slightly sprawling hand of a man not much given to correspondence. The Whitfield family had the boarding house running well and had opened a second dining table for the public, and Millbrook had gotten a new blacksmith and a small school, and Amos Cutter had quietly sold his Millbrook holdings and relocated to El Paso, where he was apparently doing very much the same thing he had done in Millbrook, but somewhere far enough away from the federal investigators' previous attention that he presumably felt safer. Benjamin read this last part to Rose, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, with characteristic economy, "That is someone else's problem now. I hope they have documentation." In the second spring on the Pico's land, Rose Grayson Thatcher, who had been quietly certain for several weeks, confirmed to her husband on a morning in April when the cottonwood buds were just beginning to unfold that they were expecting a child. He was standing at the kitchen table with his coffee when she told him, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that she observed with the focused attention she turned on everything she wanted to remember. First a moment of perfect stillness, then something that moved through his features like light through water, then a smile that was not the bright grin she had seen before but something quieter and deeper, something that came from a part of him that the bright grin did not reach. He set down the coffee cup and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands in the particular gentle, specific way he had, and looked at her for a long moment with everything he felt fully visible in his eyes, this man who was always honest. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing he said, and it was entirely characteristic. "I am very well," she said. "Better than I have ever been." The child was born in November, which was a good month for it. The worst of the summer heat long finished, the air cool and sweet, the cottonwoods in their full yellow autumn color. The birth was difficult, as first births often are, and lasted through a long night and into the following morning. Benjamin sat outside the bedroom door for the entire duration, which was long enough that he wore a groove in the floorboards that was still there 20 years later. The midwife, a Mexican woman named Senora Reyes from the settlement who had attended more births in this country than she could count, and who had the calm authority of someone who has seen everything and remained unflappable through all of it, emerged from the bedroom at 6 in the morning with a small wrapped bundle and a satisfied expression. "A son," she told Benjamin. He stood up from the chair so quickly that he knocked it back against the wall. "And Rose." "Your wife is strong," Senora Reyes said with a smile that contained a great deal of approval. "She works hard even at the things that hurt. Come and see them." The baby was dark-haired and red-faced and loud, and he was the most extraordinary thing Benjamin Thatcher had ever seen in a life that had contained some fairly extraordinary things. He sat on the edge of the bed and held this small, specific person with the careful, reverent attention of a man handling something of inconceivable value, and looked at his wife's tired, luminous face on the pillow, and thought about 40 miles of desert and a horse given away, and a land claim, and a letter, and a stage, and a woman with copper hair at a dry goods counter, and the extraordinary particular series of moments that had led to this room and this morning, and this child in his hands. "James Harold Thatcher," Rose said, watching his face. "For the little boy on the road, if you agree, and Harold for my father." He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that she had learned to read over more than a year of marriage. The deep, complete, ungovernable love of a man who loves not easily but entirely. "James Harold," he said. "Yes, that is exactly right." The baby opened his eyes and looked at his father with the ancient, unimpressed gaze of the newly born, and Benjamin laughed, and Rose laughed with him, and the morning came through the east-facing kitchen window in a long golden stream and filled the house with light. The years that followed were the kind of years that build a life in the truest sense of the word, the accumulation of ordinary days that are in their ordinariness extraordinary, because the person you are sharing them with makes every day a day worth the having. The land flourished under their combined and complementary forms of attention. Benjamin expanded the herd carefully, learning the grazing patterns of the land across 3 years of seasons before committing to a larger operation. Rose expanded the garden into something substantial, eventually supplying vegetables and dried herbs to 2 neighboring settlements as a small but consistent source of additional income, and developing a local reputation for the quality of her produce that brought people to the Pecos Bend with the kind of purpose usually reserved for merchants rather than farmers. James Harold Thatcher was a dark-eyed, energetic child who walked at 10 months and talked at 11, and climbed everything in sight from the moment he could reach anything worth climbing, and who had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness in a combination that produced a very small person with a very definite character. He was 4 when his sister was born, a round-cheeked, red-haired girl they named Clara for Benjamin's mother, who arrived more quickly than her brother and with considerably less drama, as though she had learned from his example and decided to be practical about it from the start. They had one more child after Clara, a second son, born when Rose was 29 and Benjamin 32, a quiet and observant child they named William, who from his earliest months displayed a particular intense interest in the natural world that would eventually take him, years later, in a direction that Benjamin admitted he had not entirely anticipated, but Rose said she had seen coming from the day William first tried to hold a grasshopper still long enough to look at it properly. His sister Mary came to visit in the spring after James Harold was born and stayed for 6 weeks, which was how long it took her to admit that she had not planned to stay that long but had found it impossible to leave. She and Rose developed the easy friendship of women who recognize in each other a particular quality of mind, and the letters between them afterward were long and frequent and full of the kind of content that sustained two intelligent women across the distance between Kansas City and the Pecos Bend. One evening in the summer of 1882, when James Harold was 3 and Clara was a newborn and the evening air smelled of sage and the river and the last warmth of the day, Benjamin and Rose sat on the porch of the house they had built together, which had grown by 2 rooms and a deep front porch over the preceding years, and watched the western sky do its customary late performance of improbable colors. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked. In the comfortable way she asked him things now, without the careful formality of their earlier conversations. She meant the horse. She meant the walk. She meant all the particular decisions that had led him to Millbrook and to her. "Not for a single day," he said. She looked at him with the green-gray eyes that he had been looking at for 4 years and that still rewarded looking at carefully, perhaps more so than ever, because there was more in them now, more accumulated light and depth. "Not even the 40 miles in the dark?" she asked. "Especially not those," he said. "Those miles led somewhere worth being." She leaned her head against his shoulder with the particular settled ease of someone who has fully arrived at the life they wanted, and they watched the sky go from copper to rose to the first deep blue of evening, and the cottonwoods rustled in the river wind, and from inside the house came the soft sounds of their children sleeping. In the cool dark of the desert night, with the Pecos running steady over its stones and the stars unfolding above the bottomland in their ancient, indifferent brilliance, the house on the Pecos Bend was exactly what it had been built to be. A place where 2 people had chosen each other fully and built something lasting from that choice, where the land was good, and the water ran clean, and the children grew in the particular freedom of a place that had been made with love and maintained with care. Benjamin Thatcher had given his horse to a starving family and walked 40 miles through the desert, and it had cost him a great deal and led him to everything that mattered. Rose Grayson had kept her accounts in a small leather book and held her ground against an honest creditor and run her house through 3 years of crisis with unflinching competence, and it had led her to a man who saw her fully and loved what he saw and would walk any desert to stand beside her. The cottonwoods grew tall and strong along the river bend, and the house stood solid against the seasons, and the Pecos ran on through the years in its ancient course, and the family that had put down roots in that good bottomland grew and was well, and the debts of the past were all paid in full, and the future was wide and bright and entirely their own.